Valley, we think of it as a really modern place, but actually its origins lie 70 plus years ago and actually came out of a moment of great crisis, the 1930s and 1940s in the United States, when, among other things, both through the response to the Great Depression and then the mobilization of World War II, fundamentally realigned the role that the government had, not just in its relationship with industry, but in its becoming a major funder of scientific research and development. And so what happened in the American case that became the genesis of Silicon Valley is that money poured in from the public sector into blue sky development of technologies like mainframe computing and computer communication, and also all sorts of things that initially didn't have a large commercial market. And also investments in microelectronics and in communication, radar and microwave communication. And these are the building blocks for Silicon Valley. So I think the takeaway here is not just that government has a big role, which it does, and there's certain things that government does in terms of funding education and technology and the building blocks of next generation economies. But also, importantly, what happens in the American case is the government puts a lot of money in and then kind of gets out of the way. That the private sector has a big role to play, that this money flows from the federal government to universities, both public and private, flows to private sector companies, both large and small, all the way from big guys like Lockheed, aerospace giants like Lockheed and Boeing, down to small startup companies that were the foundational companies of Silicon Valley, like Fairchild Semiconductor. Technology companies have great power and great responsibility too, yes. They aren't the only solution. Tech is not going to fix this. I think we're already seeing the limits to which a technological app or a particular digital technology can remedy what is not only a grave global public health crisis, but an economic crisis as well. I think contact tracing is a great example of where you have a solution that involves tech and involves very old-fashioned non-technical things and things that the public sector and other actors, nonprofits, can do, where you have Apple and Google who are working together in the United States to build a contact tracing app, working with public health departments that will be Bluetooth enabled and allow infection to be traced in the United States. But that's only going to be part of it. It's also going to require human beings going through and doing the shoe leather of contact tracing. So I think that tech has a very important role, but I think it's one that's in this larger ecosystem that's public, private, and nonprofit, and recognizing that all of these sectors working together can be greater than the sum is greater than the parts. I think the working from home is fascinating on a number of metrics. One is that it's shown that the internet economy's ability to scale and grow has been amazing. I mean, let's talk about this incredible success story of companies like Zoom that have scaled 10x, 20x, 30x their subscriber base in a very short amount of time. And also large companies like Amazon and Facebook that have become these platform utilities for this new shelter-in-place, work-from-home moment. Google and the other purveyors of educational software as well. But it's really interesting for an industry that for so long really emphasized being in person as part of its workplace culture, of saying remote work isn't part of what we do. You can't do that if you work at these places. We're going to build these campuses with these free snack bars, with all these, amenities that are, reinforcing our company culture, that we actually think part of our innovative edge is that you can connect with someone at the water cooler or the snack bar, that this physical proximity is really, really important to our business model. And what work from home is showing is that maybe not so much. And even, right now we're seeing these major companies not only say, we're going to work from home for the remainder of the calendar year, but now we have companies like Twitter coming out and saying, you can work from home forever, which is, again, going against this culture that has valued proximity. Now, does this mean that we're all going to be just sitting in our homes talking to one another on video conferencing? Not so sure. There is, even in places like Silicon Valley where the housing prices got so high, it became more and more difficult to get around. people still flooded in there because proximity and physical proximity did matter. So I don't see that just vaporizing. But I do see opportunity opening up. We're already seeing Silicon Valley effectively as a global network of many, many regions. And we're seeing organic tech communities and very distinct tech communities growing in other places in a way that's more than just a municipality or a region decides to build a research park and hopes people will come. It's been actually something that has been more from the ground up, that has, where you have clusters of startups that are specializing and building on the core competencies of a region. I would imagine in a post-COVID world that that trend could accelerate. And you're also going to have people who are opting for place and quality of life in a certain place over, I have to be in the Bay Area because Google's there, and if I want to do this job at Google, I have to be there. Now they could live somewhere else in the United States, they could live somewhere else in the world. It's just your tolerance for bridging time zones and having late night teleconferences that is your only barrier. So this is going to be really interesting. I think creates opportunity for other geographies, and it's something that every tech company and any company that's operating multinationally needs to think about seriously. If we look through history, I think history gives us some really useful comps here that has some useful predictive value for what might happen next for tech, which is that the tech companies have grown very large, particularly the five largest, but there are also many others that are coming up on their heels in a pretty deregulated environment in the United States and to a lesser degree in Europe. But because these tech companies are US based, US headquartered, that has been allowed a certain contours of growth. And in the last few years, there's been this increasing drumbeat in the United States as well as in the EU for firmer regulation of these large entities and also discussions about breaking them up. I think that, you know, in a post-COVID world where there is increased dependence on technology, where the cloud is even more where things are at and where business is happening, it gives a case for companies that say, well, you can't break us up because our bigness enables us to be this, deliver this essential service. But at the same time, I think it also increases the pressure, the regulatory pressure. If we look back through American history, we see examples of these new high-tech industries that grow. In the late 19th century, it was railroads and oil and steel. And in the 1920s and 1930s, it was the automakers. And they grow large, and then they get to a certain point and the government comes in and regulates them for the safety and the security of their customers, regulates them to maintain market competition. And I would imagine that we could see, you know, this crisis is not going to diffuse the energy behind the regulatory conversation. In fact, it might accelerate it. Same goes for the conversation about workers' rights and worker activism, particularly the blue collar areas of tech, like the Amazon warehouse workers or the Uber drivers or the food couriers, who in this pandemic have proven to be the essential workers whose health and safety and economic well-being is what the economy depends upon. Well, look, times of great crisis are times of opportunity. It is what we've seen in the past is that crisis becomes an accelerant of change. So changes that are bubbling along start speeding up. Political momentum for big policy change grows amid crisis, particularly economic crisis. We saw this in the United States in the 1930s with the response to the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt's agenda, his New Deal, was really comprised of ideas that had been kicking around activist circles for about 30 or 40 years, but hadn't had the political momentum to get activated. And so I think we could imagine that this could be an opportunity for policy and political change. And I'll be watching for that. But I think also business change. I think there are opportunities for, you know, in a way, this has been this forced pause button for all of us to sit back and rethink, both as individuals and as corporate leaders and as leaders of our organizations, and thinking about, you know, not only ourselves, but the places we work and the places we live and what we value about those, what we want to see going forward, where this becomes an opportunity to get rid of the things that weren't working and focus on the new. And I think there's also opportunity for new markets, for new technologies, radically rethinking some very everyday ways that the industrialized world goes about its business. You know, how is air travel going to change? How is the business of higher education, which I'm in, going to change? How are, you know, even sort of the very kind of day-to-day interactions we have and the way that individuals, people live their lives and the way communities work, how will that change? I don't think this means that we all physically distance and hide away forever. That's not sustainable. But what does a new society look like that's about human flourishing, that's about economic flourishing, along with that eases some of the, I think there are a lot of, you know, a lot of business leaders, a lot of political leaders have been concerned about the trajectory. You have, you know, the Business Roundtable here in the United States last year talking about a new measure of business success that goes beyond shareholder value, for example. So how can this crisis in this moment kind of create a reset for all these different sectors to think about profitability in different ways and what outcomes we want to see as collectively and individually?